The moment Jane Grady stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, the wind hit her like a living thing, pulling at the pins in her hair and tasting of dry earth and possibility, and she thought that maybe, just maybe, the territory had something to say to her that Philadelphia never could. She was 26 years old with a widow's ring still on her finger and a leather satchel containing everything she had chosen to keep. That was the important part, chosen to keep. The rest of it, the fine china, the parlor furniture, the life that had belonged to Margaret Grady, who became Margaret Holloway, and then became a woman who disappeared quietly inside a house on Chestnut Street, all of that had been left behind on purpose. The ring she still wore because taking it off had felt, on the morning she packed, too much like a declaration she was not yet ready to make. She was not mourning Edmund Holloway. She had done that, briefly and honestly, in the first weeks after his death from fever 2 years prior. What she had been mourning and was only now beginning to understand was the version of herself she had allowed to be packed away like good silver, brought out only for occasions and kept otherwise in the dark. Her mother had wept. Her older sister Caroline had called it reckless. Her late husband's brother had used the word unseemly, which was, Jane had thought while cinching the straps on her trunk, the least useful word in the English language. She had kissed her mother's cheek, told Caroline to write, and boarded the train west with a schoolteacher's certificate, $300 sewn into the lining of her traveling coat, and a letter of correspondence from the Sumner County School Board indicating that Caldwell's one-room schoolhouse had lost its teacher to marriage in February and needed a replacement before summer's end. That had been 3 weeks and 2 stagecoach legs ago. Now she stood on a wide dirt street with the stagecoach driver heaving her trunk down from the top of the coach, and the whole of Caldwell spread before her, which was to say, not very much. A main street with a row of false-fronted buildings, a livery at one end, a hotel called the Drover's Rest at the other, a general store, a sheriff's office, 2 saloons sitting across from each other like men at the same argument, and a scattering of houses on the side streets that faded quickly into open grassland. The sky was enormous. She had not been prepared for how enormous the sky would be. "You need help with that, ma'am." The voice came from beside her, and she turned to find a man who had apparently been tying his horse to the post outside the general store when the stagecoach arrived. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean and tall with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes beneath the brim of a worn hat. He was looking at her trunk with the practical expression of a man who simply saw a problem that needed solving, which she appreciated more than she could have said in that moment. "I would be grateful," she said. "I am looking for the Drover's Rest." "That way," he said, nodding down the street, and then he crouched and took the handle of her trunk. The stagecoach driver released the other handle with evident relief, and the tall man straightened his end of it without visible effort. He looked at her with a kind of quiet patience that was not quite a question. "I can take the other end," she said. "You can," he agreed simply and waited. She liked that he did not tell her she could not. She took the handle, and together they carried her trunk down the main street of Caldwell toward the hotel while the afternoon sun laid everything in gold. "Are you the new schoolteacher?" he asked. "How did you know there was a new schoolteacher coming?" "Small town," he said. "There are 7 things people talk about. The weather, cattle prices, who is getting married, who is getting divorced, who has died, what the county commissioners are doing wrong, and the schoolteacher." She almost laughed. It surprised her, that almost laugh, because she had not come close to one in a long time. "Jane Grady," she said. "Cornelius Stone," he said. His voice was flat and matter-of-fact when he said it, like a man who had long since made peace with having an unusual name. "Cornelius," she repeated. "Yes," he said, and his mouth curved slightly at one corner. "My mother had opinions about names." They set her trunk down at the door of the Drover's Rest. He touched the brim of his hat, a proper cowboy's hat, sweat-stained and shaped by years of wear, and said, "Welcome to Caldwell, Miss Grady." She thought to correct the Miss to Mrs., but did not. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," she said instead. He walked back down the street toward the general store, and she watched him go for perhaps one moment longer than was strictly necessary before pushing through the door of the hotel. The Drover's Rest was run by a woman named Dottie Marsh, who was 53 years old and ran things with the kind of cheerful efficiency that made you feel immediately that you were in capable hands. She had a room ready for Jane on the second floor, small but clean, with a window that looked out over the street and a wood-burning stove in the corner that would matter considerably more in winter than it did now. She fed Jane beef stew and cornbread in the small dining room and told her everything she needed to know about Caldwell in the time it took to eat it. The school was on the eastern edge of town, a single room with a potbelly stove and 22 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old whose learning had been interrupted since February and who had consequently, according to Dottie Marsh, become something of a menace. The school board chairman was a man named Gerald Holt, who ran the general store and had 3 of those 22 students himself. The doctor was a man named Abernathy, who was 70 and reliable. The sheriff was a man named Prentice, who was 40 and cautious in the way that men in cattle towns needed to be cautious. The 2 saloons, she said, belonged to 2 brothers who had stopped speaking in 1873 and had expressed their estrangement by building competing establishments directly across the street from each other. And Cornelius Stone? Jane asked, because the question was there before she could think better of it. Dottie Marsh's expression did the thing that expressions do in small towns when someone unexpected asks about someone expected to be asked about. Neil Stone, she said, with a small, carefully neutral smile. He runs a horse ranch about 4 miles south of town. Been here 6 years. He breeds horses for the cavalry mostly and some for private sale. Good man, quiet. She paused. Lost his wife 3 years ago. Fever took her. He has a son, 7 years old, Thomas. Jane looked at her stew. I see, she said. He is not much of a talking man, Dottie added, but he is a good one. Jane went to bed that night with the window open and the sound of Caldwell settling around her, the distant laughter from one of the saloons, the creak of the building, the vast quiet beyond the town's small noise, and she thought about beginning again, and how it did not feel as clean and clear as she had imagined it would in Philadelphia. It felt more like standing at the edge of something without knowing how deep it went. She started school on a Monday in late April. The 22 students were exactly as described, restless from months of irregular learning, suspicious of a new teacher, and in the case of the older boys, openly doubtful that a woman from back east could tell them anything they needed to know. Jane had expected this. She had spent 2 years teaching at a school in Philadelphia after Edmund's death, and she understood that children tested new adults the way cats tested strangers, carefully, and with intent. She was firm without being unkind, patient without being passive, and by the second week she had the classroom running with something approaching order. By the third week, the restless boys who had been most skeptical were the same ones staying after school to ask questions she had not had time to answer during lessons. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. It was, she thought, the thing she had given up most reluctantly in marrying Edmund and being expected to give up working, and getting it back felt like standing up straight after years of walking bent. She saw Cornelius Stone on Saturdays when he came into town for supplies. Not every Saturday, but most of them. She would see him at the general store or outside the livery, sometimes with the boy Thomas, who was a serious-faced child with his father's dark eyes and a habit of watching everything without appearing to. She and Cornelius would exchange pleasantries. He would ask how the school was going. She would ask about his horses. Thomas would stand beside his father and observe everything with that careful, measuring look that made Jane feel, oddly, as though the child was taking notes. One Saturday in May, she was leaving the general store with a parcel of books she had ordered from the catalog when she misjudged the step down from the boardwalk, and the parcel went one way and she went another, and before she could do much about either situation, Cornelius Stone's hand was at her elbow and the books had been caught against the boardwalk post by some fortunate alignment of physics. "Are you all right?" he asked. He had not let go of her elbow. "I am fine," she said, somewhat flushed. "Thank you again." He bent and collected the books, looking at the titles as he handed them back. She watched his face go through something when he read them, a kind of quiet surprise that became a kind of quiet interest. "These are not school books," he said. "No," she agreed. "Not all of my reading has to be for the children." He looked up at her. The books were a collection of essays by John Stuart Mill, a novel by George Eliot, and a volume of poetry by Walt Whitman. "Mill and Eliot in Caldwell," he said, with that slight curve at the corner of his mouth. "Is that strange?" "It is unusual," he said. "I have the Eliot Middlemark." She stared at him. "You have Middlemark." "It was my wife's," he said, and something shifted briefly in his expression, not grief exactly, but the echo of it, the outline where grief had been and been worked through and left a shape behind. "I kept her books." "That is a very good reason to have kept them," Jane said softly. Thomas appeared at his father's side then, having apparently been inspecting something in the window of the general store, and looked between Jane and his father with that assessing gaze. "You are the school teacher," he said to Jane. It was not a question. "I am," she said. "My father says you are good at it." Cornelius Stone looked briefly at the sky with the expression of a man who had been slightly betrayed by his own child. Jane looked at the boy seriously. "Your father is very kind to say so." "He does not say things that are not true," Thomas said, with the absolute conviction of a child who has never considered that his father might have ordinary social habits. "That is a very good quality," Jane said. Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to examining the store window. Jane looked at Cornelius, who was watching her with an expression she could not fully read, but that felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the May sunshine. "He is an honest judge of character," Cornelius said. "So I gathered," she said. They stood there on the boardwalk for a moment longer than was necessary, and then they both seemed to become aware of it at the same moment, and the pleasant awkwardness of that awareness made them each look away. "I had better get back," she said. "Yes," he said. She walked back to the Drover's Rest with the books under her arm and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do, which was to feel interested, genuinely and specifically interested, in another person for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember. She told herself it was nothing. She had come to the territory to begin again, not to immediately fall into the same arrangements she had left behind. She was here to stand on her own feet, to be the version of herself she had been boxing away since her early 20s. She told herself all of this firmly and sensibly, and went about her life. It did not change the fact that Cornelius Stone was occupying a corner of her thoughts with increasing regularity. June arrived with heat and lightning storms that rolled across the flat land in spectacular displays that left Jane standing at her schoolroom window, jaw unhinged, while her students pretended to be less impressed because they were locals and had presumably seen storms before. She learned to ride during June because she had decided that a woman in Kansas who could not ride was at a practical disadvantage, and the livery owner, a taciturn man named Aldous who smelled of hay and saddle leather, agreed to teach her on Tuesday evenings for a small fee. She was not a natural. The first horse assigned to her was a placid brown mare named Penny who was patient with beginners, and even patient Penny seemed faintly exasperated with Jane during the first 2 lessons. But Jane was stubborn in the way that women who have decided to remake themselves are stubborn, which is to say absolutely and without reservation, and by the 3rd week she was walking Penny around the paddock without incident, and by the 4th she was managing a trot. It was on one of these Tuesday evenings that Cornelius Stone came to the livery to pick up a horse he had left to be shod, and found Jane Grady trotting around a paddock with intense concentration, and her hat pushed slightly crooked by the wind. He stopped at the fence and watched. She did not notice him until she had completed her circuit and brought Penny to a halt near the gate, and then she looked up and found him there, and her composure slipped just slightly. "Mr. Stone," she said. "Miss Grady," he said. He was smiling. Not broadly but genuinely, the kind of smile that a normally quiet face makes when it is not trying to. "I am learning," she said. "I can see that," he said. "You are doing well. You are being generous." "I am being accurate," he said, and there was that echo of Thomas's certainty in it, the same quality of a man who did not say things unless he meant them, and she felt the warmth of it somewhere in the center of her chest. "Your son tells me you do not say things that are not true," she said. "He is correct," Cornelius said. "You are doing well for a month in, better than I did. You learned to ride." "I grew up in Ohio," he said. "I had to learn when I came west. I fell off more times than I care to admit." She laughed. It was a real laugh this time, unguarded and genuine, and it seemed to surprise both of them. The evening light was long and golden across the paddock, and the smell of hay and horses and the Kansas earth was all around them, and she thought, sitting on Patient Penny with her hat at a slightly wrong angle, that she had not felt this pleasantly present in a place in years. "Would you like to ride out on Sunday?" he asked. "There is a creek south of town that has a good view of the bluffs. I take Thomas most Sundays. It is worth seeing." He said it straightforwardly and without apparent anxiety, but something in the slight pause before worth seeing made her think the invitation had cost him something, which in turn made her feel its value more clearly. "I would like that very much," she said. He nodded, and the smile came back briefly. "Sunday morning, then. Say 8 o'clock. 8 o'clock, she agreed. He collected his horse from Aldous and rode out in the long evening light, and Jane watched him go and then looked at Penny, who expressed no opinion. Sunday came with high blue sky and a warm, clean wind. Cornelius arrived at the Drovers' Rest at 8 o'clock exactly with 2 horses. A big gray that was clearly his and a smaller chestnut mare with a composed expression that he introduced as Clara, who was, he said, his most reliable horse and also the gentlest, which Jane appreciated as a still-developing rider. Thomas was on a small brown pony beside his father, his feet in the stirrups and his small back very straight, wearing a hat that was identical in shape to his father's, and that made Jane's heart perform an entirely unasked-for squeeze. They rode south out of Caldwell into the open grassland, and Jane discovered that the territory looked completely different from the back of a horse than it did from the ground or the stagecoach. From horseback the grass was all around you, chest-high in places, moving in the wind like a slow breathing, and the sky was even bigger because you were elevated, and the horizon was wider, and the whole world felt enormous and honest and clean. Thomas rode mostly beside his father but kept looking over at Jane with that measuring gaze, and about a mile south of town he suddenly said, "My father says you came from Philadelphia." "I did," Jane said. "What is it like there?" "Very crowded," she said. "Very loud, many buildings very close together. The streets are paved with cobblestones." Thomas considered this. "Do you miss it?" She thought about it honestly, the way she had promised herself she would approach the new life honestly. "I miss my mother," she said, "and my sister, but not the place itself. I think some places are for some seasons of your life and some places are for others." Thomas seemed to find this satisfactory. He looked at his father. "Like how you say Ohio was for before and Kansas is for now." Cornelius met Jane's eyes briefly with an expression that was part rueful and part something warmer. "Something like that," he said. The creek was everything he had promised. It cut through a shallow draw in the land where cottonwood trees grew along the bank, their leaves turning silver in the breeze, and the bluffs rose on the far side in layers of yellow and red stone that caught the morning sun and glowed. They tied the horses, and Thomas immediately went to investigate the creek bank for frogs with the focused energy of a 7-year-old, who has briefly set aside all dignity in favor of amphibians. Jane and Cornelius sat on a flat rock near the water. For a while they were simply quiet in the way that some people can be quiet together, not an empty silence but a full one, with the sound of the water and the wind and Thomas's periodic announcements from down the bank about the relative size and speed of things he was finding. "How long have you been in Kansas?" she asked eventually. "6 years," he said. "I came out from Ohio in 1873. I had $20 and a saddle and an idea about horses." "What kind of idea?" "That the cavalry needed remounts constantly, and that the men supplying them were mostly not breeding for the right qualities. Speed gets the attention, but it is the horses that can endure, that can keep going when they are exhausted and keep their heads when they are frightened. Those are the horses that matter in the field." He said it with the easy authority of someone describing what they have spent years learning. "I found the land, built the stock slowly, made a contract with Fort Dodge 2 years in. It worked." "It sounds like it was not easy," she said. "It was not," he agreed. He picked up a flat stone and turned it over in his hand. "The first winter I lived in a dugout. My wife, her name was Sarah, she came out in the spring of 1874. She said she had not expected it to be quite so relentlessly horizontal." Jane smiled. "I know exactly what she meant. But she loved it," he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice was both tender and matter-of-fact, the way a man speaks about something he has fully accepted and fully grieved and fully kept. "She had a way of finding the beauty in what was hard. Thomas has that from her." "He seems like an extraordinary child," Jane said. "He is," Cornelius said simply. He threw the stone and it skipped twice on the water. Since his mother died, he has been very quiet about it. He did not cry much. He just decided, it seemed, that he would take care of me. At 7 years old, he decided that." Jane felt the sharp ache of that in her chest. "That must be difficult to watch." "It is," he said. "I try to make sure he knows he does not have to, that it is all right to be a child and to need things. But it is not an easy lesson to teach when the example at hand is a man who spent 6 months convincing himself he was fine when he was not." She looked at him. He was looking at the creek, his expression honest and undefended in a way that surprised her, as though he had said more than he intended and was not sure whether to be sorry about it. "I understand that," she said quietly. "The convincing yourself. I did it for a long time after Edmund died. I was very good at being fine." He turned to look at her. "What happened?" he asked, and she knew he did not mean simply Edmund's death but the whole shape of it, how she had gotten from there to here, and something about the directness of the question made her trust it. "He was a good man," she said carefully. "Not a bad man at all. He was kind and steady, and he worked hard, and he loved me in his way. But the life it was very small, very prescribed. I was supposed to be a certain kind of woman in a certain kind of house on a certain kind of street. And I tried to be her for 5 years, and when he died I realized I had tried so hard that I had nearly stopped existing. The real me. The one that reads Mill and wants to teach and wants to see the sky be large." She stopped. "That is perhaps more than you asked for." "No," he said. "That is exactly what I asked for." They looked at each other for a long moment, with the creek running between its banks and Thomas's voice floating down from further along the bank describing a frog that was, apparently, enormous. "I am glad you came to Caldwell," Cornelius said. It was so direct and so simply stated that Jane did not know what to do with it for a moment. And then she smiled, and he smiled back. And between the two of them in that moment, something quietly and irrevocably shifted. They rode back in the late morning with Thomas on his pony, declaring that he had seen the largest frog in Sumner County, and that he intended to return with a jar. Jane rode beside Cornelius, and they talked easily all the way back. About Kansas and Ohio and Philadelphia, about horses and books, and the particular challenges of teaching 14-year-olds who were already calculating that they could be earning wages. About the sky, which she could not stop noticing, and he admitted he had never stopped noticing either. By the time they reached Caldwell, she felt more like herself than she had in years. Not the self she had been before Edmund, not the Philadelphia self, but something newer and cleaner, a self that had the open sky in it. At the door of the Drover's Rest he helped her down from Clara, his hand steady at her waist for the moment required, and then immediately properly removed, and he looked at her with that quiet, warm expression that she was beginning to understand was how Cornelius Stone looked when he was feeling something he was choosing to handle carefully. "Thank you," she said, "for the creek, and the bluffs, and the company." "Any time," he said, and meant it in the specific, rather than the general way. She went inside feeling that the territory had, in fact, something to say to her that Philadelphia never could. Summer deepened and the town of Caldwell moved through its rhythms. The cattle drives came through in July, the long Texas longhorn herds moving north on the Kisham Trail, the drovers dusty and lean and trail-worn, filling the saloons for a few days before moving on toward the rail at Wichita. Jane watched the first drive come through from the window of the school, the children craning to see, and she letting them because the sight of 3,000 cattle moving past a town was, she had decided, also educational. The drives brought noise and business and some trouble. She heard shots fired one night in July from the direction of the saloons, and the next morning heard from Dottie Marsh that it had been a dispute over cards that Sheriff Prentice had resolved without anyone dying, which was apparently considered a successful resolution. The drives also brought a particular kind of rough-edged life to Caldwell that made her understand the territory in a different way, understanding the scale of the cattle economy, the distances these men had traveled, the roughness of the work, the way the West was still being shaped into something by the accumulated effort of countless hard-lived lives. She mentioned this to Cornelius on one of their Sunday rides. They had become a regular occurrence through June and into July, sometimes with Thomas left in the care of his neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Fenwick, who had a soft spot for the boy, and he listened and then said, carefully and without drama, "There are things about the territory that are not as clean as the sky." She looked at him. "Tell me." He was quiet for a moment. They were riding along the ridge south of the creek, the grassland spreading in all directions. "The Osage and the Kansa people," he said. "This land we are riding on, it was theirs before it was anyone's deed. The government moved them onto reservations and opened the land for settlement, and the way it happened was not just. Most people here do not spend much time thinking about that." "Do you?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. "I think about it. I do not know how to set it right, but I think it is important not to pretend it is not there. The land does not belong to me in the way I was told it did. I have a piece of paper that says I own it, and behind that paper is a history that is much uglier." She was quiet, thinking. "You are an unusual man, Cornelius Stone." "Am I?" he said, genuinely uncertain. "To say that," she said. "Most people I have met here and most people I knew in Philadelphia find it easier not to say that." "Easier is not always the same as right," he said. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it in the context of her own life, the easier road that she had taken for 5 years on Chestnut Street, the easier road her mother had pointed out at every junction, the way easy and right had diverged so steadily over time that she had eventually had to choose. "No," she said, "it is not." They rode in the kind of silence that has become familiar and comfortable, and then Thomas, who had been riding ahead and pretending not to listen to the adults, turned and said, "Miss Grady, are you going to stay in Caldwell?" Jane looked at the child and then at Cornelius, who was looking at his son with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not entirely succeeding. "I intend to," she said. Thomas turned back forward with the satisfied air of someone who has confirmed an important fact, and Jane looked at the enormous Kansas sky and felt something settle in her like a stone dropped into still water, the ring spreading outward and then smoothing. In August, the school board renewed her contract for the following year, which meant she could begin to think about a more permanent arrangement than the Drovers' Rest. She mentioned this to Dottie Marsh, who mentioned it to Gerald Holt at the general store, who mentioned it to his wife, who mentioned to anyone who would listen that there was a small house on Cottonwood Street that the Alderman family had left behind when they moved to Colorado in the spring, and that was sitting empty. Jane went and looked at it on a Wednesday afternoon. It was small and needed work. The porch railing was loose, several window frames needed recaulking, and the kitchen stove needed cleaning. But the rooms were bright and the yard had a cottonwood tree in it, and she stood in the front room with afternoon light coming through the windows and felt with absolute certainty that this was where she was supposed to be. She bought it for $40, which was everything she had left after her first months of expenses, and felt free in a way that a woman who has always had someone else's name on the deed cannot fully anticipate. She mentioned the purchase to Cornelius on Saturday when she saw him at the general store, and his face did something she was beginning to love, this quality of quiet, genuine gladness that was not showy but was unmistakable, like a lamp turned up low in a window. "That is good news," he said. "The porch railing is terrible," she said. "I can fix a porch railing," he said, and said it so naturally, so without making a production of the offer, that she simply said thank you, and they arranged for the following Saturday. He came with Thomas, who immediately appointed himself the official inspector of the yard and began a thorough survey of its features. Cornelius fixed the porch railing and 2 loose boards on the porch steps and recaulked the windows while Jane worked inside, scrubbing floors and cleaning the stove, and they talked through the open windows and back and forth through the door all afternoon in a way that felt easy and natural, and like something they had been doing for years. Thomas came inside at midday and presented Jane with a small flat stone from the yard that had a vein of something reddish running through it. He held it out with his father's directness and none of his father's verbal economy. "For your new house," he said, "because you should have a piece of it." She took the stone and held it in her palm and looked at this 7-year-old boy with his father's dark eyes and his mother's way of finding the beauty in things, and felt something in her chest that was large and warm and wordless. "Thank you, Thomas," she said. "I will keep it." He nodded and went back to his inspection of the yard, and she looked at Cornelius in the doorway with the afternoon light behind him, and the expression on his face made her need to look down at the stone in her hand, so that she did not do something that was too soon and too much. She put the stone on the windowsill in the kitchen, where it sat for the rest of the time she lived in that house, always. September turned the grassland amber and gold, and the air sharpened with a bite that promised the Kansas winter coming. Jane had her house and her school and her life in Caldwell, and it was, she thought, genuinely good. She had made friends, Dottie Marsh, who had become something like an older confidant, and a young woman named Alice Carmichael, who was the wife of one of the dry goods suppliers and who had a bright, sharp mind that had been waiting for someone to talk to. She had her students, who had become, over the months, genuinely dear to her in their individual ways. She had her Tuesday evenings at the livery and her own horse now, Clara, whom she had bought from Cornelius at the end of August in a transaction that had felt important to her, and that he had seemed to understand as important without her having to explain it. Clara was hers, and when she rode out alone on the Kansas grassland, she felt a freedom that was almost physical, something opening in her chest like a fist uncurling. She had Cornelius. She was not sure yet quite what she had in Cornelius. She knew what she felt had known for some time with increasing clarity, but Cornelius Stone was a careful man, a man who had loved and lost, and had a child to consider, and who was not going to rush at anything. She respected this about him even when it made her want to take him by the shoulders and say clearly and directly the thing that was true, which was that she had come to the territory to begin again, and that she had not anticipated that beginning again would feel so much like finding. They had the conversation on a September evening on her porch. They were sitting in the chairs she had bought in August, having tea, the sunset turning the western sky every shade of orange and red and the stars beginning to appear in the east. Thomas was at Mrs. Fenwick's for the evening. They had been talking about nothing consequential for some time in the pleasant way that people talk when they are comfortable, and then the comfortable silence had settled in, and then the silence had become something different, something charged and present. "Jane," he said. She looked at him. It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss before it, and it sounded, in his voice, like something he had been holding and finally set down. "Yes," she said, not answering a question but simply indicating that she was present and receiving what was coming. He looked at the sunset. "I want to say something and I want to say it correctly, so I am going to think about it for a moment before I say it." "Take all the time you need," she said. He was quiet for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he said, "When Sarah died I decided, I think that that particular part of my life was done. Not out of grief that would last forever, but out of practicality. I had Thomas. I had the ranch. I had enough. And I was right that I had enough. I was not miserable or lacking." He paused. "But then you got off the stagecoach and I helped carry your trunk and you took your end of it without being told you couldn't, and I thought about it all the way home." Jane looked at her teacup. "And then it was the books," he continued, "and the Sunday rides and the house, and the way you talk to Thomas, and the way you are honest about things that most people paper over, and the way you laugh when you actually find something funny and not when you are just expected to." He turned to look at her now. "I am not a man who is good at the way this kind of thing is usually done. I do not have the words for the speeches." "You are doing very well," she said softly. "What I mean to say," he said, looking at her with those dark eyes that were direct and warm and holding nothing back, "is that I am not interested in being alone anymore. And I am specifically interested in not being alone with you, if that is something you are interested in as well." It was, she thought, the most Cornelius Stone way of saying the thing that could possibly exist. It was practical and genuine and stripped of all the ornamentation that was not him, and it was, for that reason, exactly what she needed to hear. "Yes," she said, "that is very much something I am interested in." He let out a breath, slow and deliberate, as though he had been holding it for some time. "Good," he said. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and his hand was warm and large and certain, and he held hers with a kind of steadiness that felt like a promise, and they sat together on her porch and watched the rest of the sunset in the comfortable, charged, new kind of silence that is different from all the silences that came before. They were careful about it for a while, in the way of two people who are not young and careless but who have been shaped by their histories. They began to be seen together, in ways that the town of Caldwell registered and discussed, as Dottie Marsh reported with unabashed delight that she did not try to conceal. They had Sunday dinners at his ranch once the evenings got too cold for the porch, which meant Jane saw how he lived. The ranch house that was larger than she had imagined, built solidly and with care. The barn where he kept the horses that were his life's work. She learned the names of the horses and something about their personalities, and he showed her the things he looked for in a good horse with the patience of a man who loves his subject and is glad to share it. Thomas adapted to the change, with what appeared to be zero surprise and enormous satisfaction. He had, it became clear, decided that Jane Grady was a correct addition to their lives long before either adult had gotten there, and he treated the whole development with the air of a project that was proceeding satisfactorily. He drew her pictures on the pages of his school primer and brought her rocks from the creek and told her, one November evening at the ranch table while Cornelius pretended not to listen from the kitchen doorway, that she made the best biscuits he had ever had, which was, he clarified, a serious statement because Mrs. Fenwick's biscuits were very good. Jane looked up and found Cornelius in the doorway with the quiet, unguarded expression she had come to love most on his face, the one he only wore when he was not thinking about whether he was wearing it. "High praise," she said to Thomas, and meant it. Winter arrived hard and early that year, the first snow in mid-November, and Caldwell buckled down into the particular kind of community intimacy that cold and distance from anywhere else creates. Jane kept the school going through all but the worst storms, because the children needed it and so did she. And Cornelius drove her to school in his wagon on the worst mornings when the roads were slick, which had not been discussed or arranged, but had simply started happening. The way things between them had a tendency to simply start happening rather than being formally decided. In December, a man arrived in Caldwell who complicated things temporarily. His name was Foster Daly, and he had been Edmund Holloway's younger brother, and he had come west on a combination of business, and Jane quickly understood, an intention to bring her back. He was a compact, well-dressed man of 34 who sat across from her in the dining room of the Drovers' Rest with the careful smile of a man who believes he is doing the object of his attentions a favor. "Your mother is worried about you," he said. "I write to my mother every week," Jane said. "She is not worried. She says so in her letters." "She says that because she does not wish to add to your burdens," Foster Daly said. Jane looked at him with the patient clarity that 5 months in Kansas had given her, 5 months of wide sky and honest ground and people who said what they meant. "Mr. Daly," she said, "I appreciate that you have come a long way. I am well. The school is going well. I am happy here. Is there anything else I can do for you?" He seemed slightly taken aback by the directness. "You seem different," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I am." He stayed 3 days, and on the second evening Cornelius came to the Drovers' Rest to have supper because that was what they did on Wednesday evenings, and he was not going to alter his habits because someone from Philadelphia had arrived to express opinions. He sat beside Jane and shook Foster Daly's hand with the implacable courtesy of a man who is secure enough to be polite to someone he regards as a problem that will solve itself. And the supper was entirely civil and slightly charged in the way that suppers are when all 3 people at the table understand something that is not being stated. After supper, when Foster Daly had gone upstairs, Cornelius and Jane stood outside in the cold December night, and she told him the full history: Edmund, the marriage, the years on Chestnut Street, the gradual disappearing of herself. And he listened with the full, unhurried attention he gave everything, looking at her face. "He thinks you belong back there," Cornelius said. "He thinks I belong somewhere that is familiar and managed and does not ask anything uncomfortable of me," she said. "He is wrong." "Are you certain?" he asked, not doubtfully but checking, giving her the opportunity to be honest with both of them. She looked at him in the cold Kansas night with the stars overhead extraordinary and brilliant the way they only are in places with no competing light, and she said, "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." He nodded. Something settled in him, visibly, the slight set of his shoulders coming down. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face with the back of his fingers, so carefully, and the tenderness of it in the cold air made her want to press her face into his hand and stay there. "Good," he said. Foster Daly left on the 3rd morning. Jane wrote her mother a long, honest letter that week explaining everything, and 3 weeks later received a letter back from her mother that said, among other things, that Caroline still thinks you are being reckless, but I have always thought you needed more sky, and I want to hear everything about Mr. Stone. And Jane laughed until she cried a little, which was a new habit and a welcome one. December continued with its ice and cold, and Cornelius began talking about something that she understood was important to him in the way he approached it carefully. On a Sunday afternoon at the ranch, with Thomas napping after church and the fire going and the snow coming down outside the windows in a way that made the world feel contained and private, he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to do it correctly." She turned from the window to look at him. He was sitting in the armchair by the fire, and he had, she noticed, straightened slightly, the way he did when he was gathering himself. He was holding the brim of his hat in his hands, turning it. "I know that you came out here to be your own person," he said. "I know that is not a small thing and that you worked hard to get here and that the last thing you need is to trade one set of circumstances that constrained you for another. I want you to know that I understand that." "I know you do," she said. "And I want you to know," he continued, "that I am not asking you to stop being any version of yourself. The school, the reading, the writing, the way you will not let anything go without examining it, all of it. I am not asking you to change anything. "Cornelius," she said gently. "I am almost to the question," he said with the brief, slightly rueful smile. "I know," she said. "Take your time." He looked up at her. "Will you marry me, Jane Grady?" He asked it simply and completely, and it was the most direct thing she had ever been asked, and it came from a man she trusted completely, and it filled her up from the inside the way sunlight fills a room. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Cornelius Stone." He set the hat down and stood, and crossed to her, and took her face in his hands with the same careful, certain tenderness she had felt from him since the beginning, and kissed her for the first time. And it was not a tentative thing or an apologetic thing, but a true thing, solid and warm and tasting of the whole of the territory winter. And she kissed him back with everything she had, and felt herself fully present in it, the way she had not been fully present in anything for a very long time. They were married in March of 1880, on a clear, cold, brilliant day when the first yellow flowers were just beginning to appear on the flat land east of town. The ceremony was in the small white church at the end of Main Street, with the preacher who served Caldwell and 3 neighboring townships, and who had a round, expressive face and a voice like a hand bell. Half of Caldwell attended, which was to say most of the people Jane had come to know in the past year, Dottie Marsh in the front row with what appeared to be genuine tears of satisfaction, Alice Carmichael with her husband beside her, Gerald Holt with his family, Aldous the livery owner who wore his best hat and his least dirty vest, Sheriff Prentice who stood near the back in the easy habit of a man who always stands where he can see the whole room. Thomas was beside his father at the front, in a clean shirt that had been pressed by Mrs. Fenwick, and a hat that had been brushed, wearing the expression of someone who has personally engineered a successful outcome and is quietly pleased about it. He held the ring when it was needed with the solemn competence of a child who takes responsibilities seriously, and when the preacher said the words and Cornelius put the ring on Jane's finger, and they both said the yes that was required of them, Thomas nodded with quiet satisfaction, one single nod, as though a column of figures had come out correctly. Jane carried flowers from the first blooming of the season, the tiny yellow ones whose names she had learned from Mrs. Fenwick, and she wore the blue dress that she had made in February with Alice's help, not white. She had been married once in white, and this was something different, something newer and more honestly itself, but a blue the color of the Kansas sky on a clear day, which was exactly the right color. When they walked out of the church into the March light, Cornelius's hand in hers, Thomas on his other side, she stopped and looked at the sky, which was doing its enormous, brilliant thing, and felt something complete itself in her. Not complete like finished, but complete like a circle that has finally been drawn all the way around, the line meeting itself, and everything inside it enclosed and whole. They had a supper at the Drovers' Rest that evening because Dottie Marsh had organized it, and there was no talking her out of it, and no one wanted to. There were long tables and good food and considerable noise, and dancing later when someone brought out a fiddle, and someone else produced a harmonica, and the floor cleared, and the evening opened into something that was not formal or careful but joyful in the spontaneous, working people way that Jane had come to love about life in the territory. The way celebrations were about being present and glad rather than about putting on a performance of gladness. Cornelius danced with her, which she had not expected had assumed, given his reserve, but he danced steadily and well, with the matter-of-fact competence he brought to most things, and he held her hand and put his other hand at her waist and looked at her through the whole dance with that low-burning warmth that was the best thing about his face. "You can dance," she said. "Sarah made sure of it," he said, and said it the way he always said Sarah's name now, with honesty and without flinching, the way you honor the dead by letting them be real. "She was right, too," Jane said. He turned her in the dance, and the fiddle sang, and Thomas, across the room, was eating pie with the focus of someone who has done everything required of them and is now entitled to dessert, and Jane laughed and felt it all the way through. They moved Jane's things to the ranch in the following week: the books and the flat reddish stone from the Cottonwood house, and the good sensible things she had accumulated in her year in Caldwell. The Cottonwood house she rented to a young couple who had arrived from Missouri in February, because letting it stand empty felt wrong when it was a perfectly good house, and other people needed beginning places too. The ranch became home in the way that places become home when they are lived in honestly, the small adjustments and discoveries that happen when two lives that have been running separately begin to share the same space. She found the rhythms of the ranch, the early mornings and the smell of coffee, and the sound of horses in the barn, the quality of the light at different hours across the grassland, the way the wind spoke differently in spring and summer and fall. She kept the school going, riding Clara to town 5 days a week, which she loved because the 4 miles in each direction were hers, an hour twice a day that belonged to no one but herself and the open ground. Cornelius learned her rhythms in turn: the late nights when she was reading, the particular silence she needed when she was thinking through something difficult, the way she solved problems by talking them out rather than sitting with them the way he did. They were different in enough ways to be interesting to each other, and similar in enough ways to make the life fit. He would bring her coffee in the evenings, and she would read aloud to him when he was not yet ready to sleep, and they would talk in the long, easy way of people who have stopped performing anything for each other. Thomas thrived. The quiet, careful boy who had appointed himself his father's keeper began, slowly through the spring and summer, to be louder and more demanding and more careless in the way children are supposed to be careless, and Jane thought that this was because he no longer needed to be careful, because the household had enough adults managing it now that the child could rest from his vigilance. He brought her rocks and interesting sticks and questions of the sort that 7-year-olds produce in abundance, about everything from why horses have 4 legs and not 3 to what the stars are made of, and she answered all of them as honestly as she could, and said I do not know when she did not know, and looked it up with him when the answer was in one of her books. He started calling her Mama Jane in the fall. Not Mama, he had a mama. She was in the ground south of town with a good wooden marker, and Jane would never have wanted to replace her. But Mama Jane, which he had apparently decided on his own was the correct term, and which he deployed one evening at the supper table without preamble, looking at his plate, and neither Jane nor Cornelius said anything for a moment, and then Jane said, "I like that very much, Thomas," and that was that. Cornelius looked at her over the boy's head with his eyes full of something that was too large for the room, and she felt it land in her chest like a warm stone. In the fall of 1880, Jane realized she was expecting a child. She told Cornelius on a clear October morning when Thomas had gone to school, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup, and looking at him steadily with the combination of joy and nervousness that the situation produced in her. He sat very still for a moment, and then the slow, unguarded, full smile came across his face, the smile she so rarely saw, but that was, when it appeared, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on a human face. "You are certain?" he asked. "I am," she said. "I spoke with Dr. Abernathy yesterday." He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said honestly, "and very glad." "Me too," he said, meaning all of it. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which he had never done before and which made her feel, somewhat to her own surprise, like weeping, but in the good way, the full-to-the-brim way. She kept teaching through the fall because she was healthy and the children needed her and she was not. She informed Gerald Holt when he suggested she might consider stepping back, made of glass. Holt retreated sensibly. She kept riding Clara until December, when Cornelius suggested gently, and with evident careful preparation, that perhaps the horse riding might pause for the remaining months. And she agreed because she could see by the way he said it that it was costing him something to say it, that he was aware of the balance between her independence and his care for her, and was trying to honor both, and that trying deserved to be honored in return. January of 1881 was brutal, the way Kansas January can be brutal, with temperatures that turned breath to fog and the wind off the open grassland cutting like something with an edge. Cornelius kept the house warm with a single-minded focus and a large supply of firewood, and Thomas appointed himself the official monitor of the wood box and kept it full with a dedication that Jane found both touching and amusing. The ranch hands Cornelius had too, a steady young man named Ezra and an older Texan named Webb who had worked cattle and horses for 30 years, and who had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, kept the horses fed and the barn functional. On a night in late February when the snow was coming down sideways and the world had narrowed to the yellow warmth of the ranch house, Jane's son was born. Dr. Abernathy arrived through the snow in his wagon with the matter-of-fact competence of a man who had done this many times in many conditions, and Mrs. Fenwick came to help, and to keep Thomas occupied in the kitchen, and the whole of it was hard and long and the kind of work that reminds you of what the body is capable of. And then there was a new voice in the room, and Cornelius was beside her with his face doing something she had no words for, something too large for his face to contain. And he was holding her hand with both of his, and she was holding their son. They named him William Henry Stone, after Cornelius's father and her brother who had died as a child before she was born, and the name had weight and history, and fit the small, furious, red-faced boy who arrived in the world in a Kansas blizzard in February 1881, as though arriving in a blizzard was simply the correct way to do things. Thomas came in when Mrs. Fenwick judged the moment right and stood beside the bed and looked at his brother with the careful, measuring assessment he brought to all new information. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out one finger and touched the baby's hand very gently, and William Henry's hand closed reflexively around it with the improbable strong grip of the newborn. Thomas looked up at Jane with eyes that were his mother's eyes and his father's expression. "He is very small," he said. "He will get bigger," Jane said. "I will teach him things," Thomas said, with the certainty of a boy who has decided something is his responsibility. "I know you will," Jane said. "He is very lucky to have you." Thomas appeared to consider whether this was the right arrangement, and concluded that it was, and sat down beside the bed to maintain his new position as older brother with the same quiet, serious dedication with which he had always approached everything. Cornelius was sitting on the other side of the bed, holding Jane's hand. She was exhausted in the way that reaches the bone, and happy in the way that reaches beyond it. She looked at her husband, still a word that sat differently in her mouth than it had with Edmund, because this one felt like a choice she had made with the fullest version of herself, and he was looking at William, and then he looked at her, and his face was the open, unguarded face she had only ever seen him show in private, the one with no reserve in it at all, just the full, clear truth of what he was feeling. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. "For what?" she asked. "For getting off that stagecoach," he said. She laughed, which made her wince, which made him immediately concerned, which made her laugh again, and the baby startled at the laughing and opened his eyes for the first time very briefly, and seemed to find the world acceptable enough before closing them again. Spring came with the particular relief of springs that follow hard winters. William Henry grew at the pace babies grow, which is to say alarmingly fast and with great noise and appetite, and the ranch adapted around him. Cornelius took to carrying the baby in the mornings, while Jane slept the extra hour she needed, walking the house in that careful, steady way with William on his chest, talking quietly to him about horses and the weather and what they would plant in the kitchen garden that year. And Jane would sometimes lie in the gray pre-dawn light listening to the low sound of her husband talking to their son, and feel herself filled up with something so complete and good that it had no name. Thomas taught William things, as promised, though in the beginning these were limited to looking at things Thomas pointed at and tolerating Thomas's commentary on them. By summer, William was sitting up and grabbing at whatever was available, and Thomas was conducting what appeared to be a systematic program of introduction to every interesting object on the ranch, which Jane watched with profound affection and the practical eye of the teacher, seeing in Thomas the instinct to share knowledge that she thought might eventually, if it was given room, become something important. She mentioned this to Cornelius one evening on the porch, the summer evening warm and the fireflies beginning in the grass, William asleep inside. "Thomas has a teacher in him," she said. Cornelius was quiet for a moment. "I think you are right," he said. "Have you thought about sending him to the high school in Wichita when he is old enough?" she asked. "He has more in him than the single room in Caldwell can give." Cornelius looked at the fireflies. "I have thought about it," he said. "It would mean time away from the ranch." "He has Webb and Ezra and you," she said. "The ranch can manage." He turned to look at her. "You want him to have what you had," he said, not as an accusation but as an understanding. "I want him to have the chance to choose," she said. "That is all. His own choice when it comes to it, but I would like him to have the education that makes the choice real." Cornelius nodded slowly. "We will talk to him about it," he said. "When the time comes, ask him what he wants." "That is the exactly right approach," she said. He stretched his hand across the space between their chairs, the chairs on the porch of the ranch house now, not the cottonwood house, and she took it and they sat in the warm evening and watched the fireflies in the grass and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. In the autumn of 1881, Jane learned something about the territory that required her to do something she had not done since Philadelphia, which was to sit in a room with powerful men and say clearly, and without apologizing, that they were wrong. The matter was this. The school board had decided, led by a new member named Cresswell who had arrived in Caldwell that spring and had opinions about women who worked outside the home and what it signified, that a married woman with children should not be teaching school. There was no law against it exactly, but Cresswell had written up a resolution suggesting that such arrangements were unseemly, which was, Jane noted with a sense of grim recognition, still the least useful word in the English language, and that the school board should find a replacement. She found out about the resolution from Gerald Holt, who was uncomfortable and apologetic, and told her 3 days before the board meeting at which the vote was scheduled. She attended the board meeting. She was not invited, but she arrived and sat down, and when Gerald Holt, who was the chairman, looked at her with the expression of a man who knows something difficult is about to happen and has resigned himself to it, she said, "I understand there is a resolution on the agenda about my position. I would like to speak to it." Cresswell, who was a red-faced man of 50 who had the look of someone permanently irritated, said she had not been invited. "I noticed that, Mr. Cresswell," she said pleasantly. "Nevertheless, I am here." She spoke for 10 minutes. She spoke about her students by name and what each of them was learning, and where she believed each of them was going, and what education meant for them specifically in the territory in 1881. She spoke about the question of women who worked, and whether their working diminished their homes, and she said that in her experience the opposite was true, that women who were allowed to use their full capacities were better at everything they did, which included being wives and mothers. She spoke about the school's performance under her instruction, which by any metric was better than it had been under her predecessor, and she cited the metrics specifically. Then she sat down. The vote was 5-2 in her favor. Cresswell and one ally voted against. Everyone else, including Gerald Holt, who had 3 children in her school and knew exactly what she was worth to them, voted yes. She walked out of the meeting into the October night and found Cornelius waiting with the wagon. She had not told him she was going, but he had found out from Holt and had come anyway, not to speak for her or beside her, but to be there when she came out. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and he looked at her and she said, 5-2. The slow, full smile came across his face. "Good," he said. "Cresswell called it unseemly," she said. "He would," Cornelius said, and clicked to the horses, and they drove home in the dark under the vast Kansas stars, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and he put one arm around her on the wagon seat and held her with the steadiness that was his particular quality. The steadiness that said, "I see you, and I am here, and there is nowhere else I would be." And she thought about the stagecoach and the trunk and the beginning of the beginning, and how she had not known yet that what was coming was not just starting over, but starting something completely new. The winter of 1881 into 1882 was milder than the one before, which the territory received with gratitude. William went through his first winter with the energy and volume of a boy who had been built for purpose, demanding and joyful, and thoroughly devoted to his brother Thomas, who bore this devotion with the exasperated affection of an older sibling doing their very best. Jane watched them at the kitchen table in the evenings, Thomas doing his schoolwork while William made a mess of whatever paper he had been given to occupy him, and felt the fullness of the life she had made press against the walls of the room in the best possible way. She wrote her mother every week, and her mother wrote back faithfully. And in the spring, her mother wrote to say that she had been considering if Jane and Mr. Stone would have her a visit to Kansas to see this territory she had been reading about for 3 years. Jane showed Cornelius the letter, and he read it and said simply, "Of course she should come." Jane Grady arrived in Caldwell on the stagecoach on a May afternoon in 1882, 3 years after Jane had arrived the same way, and Jane stood on the same street and watched her mother descend with the cautious steps of a 60-year-old woman, and then straighten and look around at Caldwell with sharp, curious eyes that were Jane's eyes, and Jane went and hugged her and held on. Jane met Cornelius with the careful, measuring look of a mother who has been worrying about her daughter for 3 years, and is now assessing the source of the letters that have been saying everything is fine. She met Thomas and had her hand immediately taken, and was conducted on a tour of the ranch's features by a 9-year-old boy who wanted to show her everything. She met William, who regarded his grandmother with intense interest and then grabbed her finger with both hands, which she appeared to find satisfactory. She and Cornelius sat on the porch the second evening, Jane inside settling William for the night, and when Jane came out again, they were talking about horses, and she stopped in the doorway and watched her mother and her husband in conversation, comfortable and genuine, and thought that this was the other kind of arriving, the kind that comes later, when the place you have built is solid enough to bring your history into. "She is extraordinary," her mother said to Jane later, in the small room she was staying in, meaning Jane herself, meaning the life she had made. She said it with the frank, late-arriving understanding of a woman who had been afraid of what her daughter was doing, and had been wrong to be afraid. "I know," Jane said, meaning she was starting to know, starting to understand what it meant to have done the difficult, necessary thing and had it lead somewhere real. Jane stayed for 3 weeks and left for Philadelphia crying, which she would have denied if asked, and said she would come back in the winter if Jane would have her, and Jane said she would always have her, and meant it. The years moved through the territory the way years do in places that have seasons with real character, each one distinct, and marking the people who live through them. The ranch grew incrementally. A new pasture fenced in 1882, a second contract with a different cavalry post, the reputation for Cornelius Stone's horses spreading in the way that genuine quality spreads, by word of the people who have used the thing and want more of it. Ezra grew into a true ranch foreman, and married a young woman named Pearl, who came to work in Caldwell's other household as a seamstress, and had a fine laugh and no patience for nonsense. Webb continued to have opinions about everything, and to be right often enough that his opinions were generally worth hearing. The ranch became something with weight to it, something that had been built rather than inherited, and Jane felt the pride of that as her own, because it had been built in the years she had been part of it and she had been part of the building. She continued to teach. In 1883, the school added a second room, and she added a second teacher, a young man fresh from the normal school in Lawrence named Daniels, who was earnest and somewhat overwhelmed by the territory, and whom she spent several months steadying the same way Caldwell had steadied her, by letting him find his feet and showing him that the ground would hold. He became a good teacher and a friend, and stayed in Caldwell for years. In the spring of 1883, Jane discovered she was expecting a second child. She told Cornelius the same way she had the first time, at the kitchen table in the morning, and he did the same thing he had done the first time, the stillness, and then the slow, full smile, and then he took her hand, and she thought how a person could feel grateful for the exact same moment in 2 different years. Their daughter was born in October 1883 on a day when the grassland was golden with fall, and the air was sharp with the smell of the changing season. They named her Sarah Stone, after Jane's mother and Cornelius's first wife, which was the right thing to do, and they both knew it without having to discuss it long. She arrived into the world with considerably less drama than her brother, and regarded everything immediately with calm, dark eyes that were her father's eyes, and a quality of focused attention that made everyone who met her say she was already watching and measuring and forming conclusions. Thomas, who was 11 and had been managing expectations throughout Jane's pregnancy with the air of an experienced older sibling, came into the room and looked at his sister with the same careful assessment he brought to everything, and said, "She is less loud than William," which was true, and "her eyes are like father's," which was also true, and then sat down beside the bed and told Sarah Stone, who was 12 hours old and who Jane was fairly certain could not yet process language, a detailed account of the ranch and all the things she would eventually need to know about it. Jane looked at Cornelius over Thomas's head, and his face was the full, open, unheld expression she loved most on him, and she thought about a stagecoach and a trunk and a wide dirt street, and the wind that had hit her like a living thing, and she thought about all the ways that beginning again had looked different from what she had imagined in Philadelphia, how it had been harder in some ways and brighter in others, and how the largest surprise of all had been that you could not truly begin again alone. That beginning again required someone willing to start beside you, not behind or ahead, but beside, in the particular and equal way of 2 people who have looked at each other honestly and decided together. The years settled into themselves and Caldwell grew and changed around the Stone family, the territory becoming a state in 1861. They had arrived in what was already Kansas, but the feeling of the frontier persisted on the flat land in the way that frontiers persist in the characters of the people who have lived on them. Thomas went to the high school in Wichita at 15, as had been discussed on the porch in the summer of 1882, and came home on school breaks with new books and new ideas, and a kind of expansion about him that Jane watched with the particular satisfaction of a teacher who has had the education confirmed. He wanted to study law, he said, because there were things in the territory that were not just and someone had to argue for what was right, and Cornelius said he thought that was the right choice, and Jane said she had always thought so, and Thomas gave them both the look of a 16-year-old who suspects he is being humored, but also suspects it is sincere. William grew into himself as the years moved and turned out to be a completely different kind of person from his brother, loud where Thomas was quiet, impulsive where Thomas was considered, funny in a way that could fill a room, with Jane's capacity for asking questions and Cornelius's capacity for seeing things as they were. He wanted to work with horses, specifically and passionately, from the age of about 5, and Cornelius began teaching him in earnest when he was 8 with the patient, generous instruction of a man who had found his life's work and wanted to share it with his son. William took to the horses with a natural ease that Ezra said he had not seen in 20 years, and that was the shape of his growing. Sarah, called Nellie almost from the beginning, turned out to have her father's reserve and her grandmother Eleanor's sharp mind, and a capacity for stillness and observation that made people underestimate her right up, until the moment she made a quiet, precise statement that ended whatever argument was in progress. She was Cornelius's particular companion from an early age in the way that sometimes happens between a father and a child who share a quality, the two of them comfortable together in a silence that was full rather than empty, riding out on the ranch in the early mornings or sitting by the fire in the evenings, not always talking. On an evening in the summer of 1886, when William was 5 and Nellie was nearly 3, and Thomas was home from Wichita for the summer, and had grown tall enough to look his father in the eye, they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the long summer evening, all of them. The grassland stretched out south in the last of the light, and the first stars were appearing in the eastern sky, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the crickets had started in the grass. Cornelius had his arm around Jane on the porch swing, which had been built 2 years ago to replace the chairs, and she was leaning against him in the way she leaned against him, with her whole weight, because he was steady enough for it. Thomas was on the steps talking to Ezra's wife Pearl about something legal and complicated that had Pearl nodding and offering opinions. William was on the ground near the steps with 2 small horses he had carved from wood himself, and was conducting some kind of dramatic narrative between them. Nellie was in her father's other arm, half asleep, her dark eyes going and coming. Jane looked at all of this. She looked at the man beside her, the quiet, steady, honest man who had carried her trunk on the first afternoon, and who had meant every word he had ever said to her, and who had let her be herself completely, and stood beside her in that. Not behind and not in front, but beside, in the exact degree of equality that love, true love, required. She looked at her children, at Thomas, who was going to argue for what was right in the world, at William, who was going to work with horses and fill rooms with laughter, at Nellie, who was going to be still and see everything, and say the precise thing at the precise moment. She looked at the grassland and the enormous Kansas sky, which was everything it had been on that first afternoon when she stepped off the stagecoach, and more, because now it was hers in the way that a place becomes yours when you have lived in it honestly and built something real inside it. She had come to the territory to begin again. She had not known then what beginning again would require or cost or give. She had thought it was something she would do alone. That beginning again meant standing alone on new ground, and finding out who she was in the absence of all the old definitions. She had been right about part of that. She had found herself, the real herself, the one that needed the large sky and the work and the books and the honest questions. But she had been wrong about the alone. Beginning again had required someone willing to start beside her, not to carry her, not to lead her, not to manage her, but to be alongside her, truly alongside her, as an equal, in the particular and specific way of 2 people who have chosen each other with open eyes. She turned her head and looked at Cornelius, and he was looking at her already with that low-burning, warm expression that she had been learning and relearning for 7 years, and that still undid her, still made the world feel present and particular and full of the specific, irreplaceable fact of being here, in this life, with him. "What are you thinking?" he asked, quietly enough not to disturb Nellie, who had finally settled into full sleep. She thought about how to say it and decided on the simplest version, because the simplest version was truest. "That I am glad the stagecoach came to Caldwell," she said. He smiled the full, slow smile, the rarest and most precious of his expressions. "So am I," he said. He kissed her hair very gently, and she pressed closer against his side, and the Kansas evening opened around them with its stars and its grassland and its enormous patient sky. And inside the house the stove ticked as it cooled and the good books stood on the shelves, and on the kitchen windowsill there was still a small flat stone with a reddish vein through it, placed there years ago by a 7-year-old boy who had known before either of the adults did that this was where it all belonged, and everything was. In the full and honest and lasting meaning of the word, home.